Cool, we're recording. Right, thanks everyone for coming to our lecture. Another Thursday. Really excited for today's one. Just want to thank Reba for sponsoring our series. Jubilee.
Yeah, thanks for that, Ben. Welcome everyone to this lecture this week. We're really excited to be hosting George Aboagye Williams, who is a Black Architect of Tomorrow nominee for RIBA and is also currently a Part 3 architecture student. He said he just had a submission today, so it's nice that he's taken the time to come speak to us. Yeah, so I'll hand over to George now.
Thanks for that, Jubilee. Thanks for that, Ben. Hi, everyone. My name is George Aboagye Williams. Today, I'm going to be doing a presentation on using my cultural identity as a case study in architecture for my Part 2 project. And I had a specific look at Afrofuturism and incorporating parts of my cultural identity as well as other aspects of African culture. And this kind of came off the back of the Black Panther film coming out. It was actually quite a convenient time. I'd been looking at Afrofuturism prior to this, but the film coming out just helped things kind of run smoothly in that sense. So basically, I'm British born Ghanaian, grew up in London. Growing up, architecture was kind of far from my mind, growing up in a council estate until I got a little bit older. And moving forward, most of my experiences kind of dictated how I'd go about my course of study within GCSE A level to kind of reach the architectural stage in university. So within this discussion, as mentioned, I'll be talking about how I incorporated my my cultural identity. So throughout my course of study, had kind of like a traditional outlook at architecture, looking at European-based architecture, and kind of developing skills using that. Sci-fi being one of my greatest interests, it kind of informed how I did my designs during my years prior to my 5th year in Part 2. And I also had a look at African culture, culture as a study in undergrad in my 3rd year project, with that being based in Peckham. For my 5th year, I had this notion of doing Afrofuturism architecture and kind of looking at the vernacular and incorporating these elements. In this flow chart, what it kind of described how I'd go through it. So looking at what Afrofuturism is, defining it, defining a timeline in Afrofuturism, defining an architectural timeline of African architecture, and looking at the regional differences, and kind of getting all these things together to come up with my final output. So one of the first few images I did was created a collage using elements of sci-fi, music, and existing historical architectures to kind of set the theme for my overall project. And it wasn't just that I would be taking architectural influences, but it was more of a cultural experience in going through Afrofuturism. As I was going through it, I realized that Afrofuturism was a thing where it's not African entirely, but it was kind of coined by a French journalist, and using these elements that he had experienced through music and storytelling, he kind of coined this name Afrofuturism to describe it as a thing. So when we look at the culture as diaspora, whether you're African, Asian, or Arab, there's a space that a friend of mine coined in their study called the third space. And the third space is kind of where you're neither here nor there culturally, but you've got this new thing for yourself. But that was my understanding of what they had described. My friend Rayan had kind of explored that and growing up in London, but also having African and Arabic culture within her heritage and kind of moving forward with that and describing it through. So, but with my take on it, I was looking at West African culture, and the third space kind of describes what Afrofuturism is in a way. I wouldn't say it solely does it describing that. So Yatasha Womack had written a book called Afrofuturism, the World of Black Sci-Fi and Fantasy Culture. As a piece of literature which brings about different pieces of media together and describing what Afrofuturism is through text and her experiences with Afrofuturism. So this kind of serving as like a guidebook as to how to approach things for myself. And drawing inspiration and reusing and recycling these elements. So the project themes were following, as I mentioned before, music, film, and artwork. And then kind of coming up with these things and putting them together to create these new environments. This is a piece by artist Iran El Nayal, where she's describing the third space and it being the space in between. And she made a series of images. And then you have like your virtual memory theater by Dhruv Golabchande of narrative practice and exploring different memories and creating an architectural piece of this. So all of these themes kind of align with what I was doing. Looking at artworks by Kerry James Marshall and keeping the culture and realizing that space is the place, so kind of pushing that forward for Afrofuturism. So you had musical inspirations like Parliament Funkadelic, George Clinton, and Janelle Monáe in how she expresses her narrative through her music, and the android being the alien, and exploring her new environment. Now, going back to the Black Panther theme, in the film, they use a lot of shanty-like mega structures, which in a way is great as a visual piece, from my opinion, but at the same time, it kind of does a weird disservice in terms of culture, because from my understanding, especially now with things that have gone on, it's important that we don't treat Black as a monolith. The Black experience within a white majority may be shared, but as a culture overall, it's important to respect that the African experience is not a monolithic one, and there are different aspects of culture throughout the continent that make the continent a whole. So going through that, I have a timeline of where Afrofuturism started and where it's going and where it could possibly go. Part of because that was where I was most familiar with. So this painting was done in a cave in Mali, and it inspired this image as it was supposed to describe the Dogon star, Sirius, I think it was B, and made an orrery using that from the inspiration of this cave drawing, incorporating Western aspect. And I started to look at a shrine in Ghana, which used Adinkra symbols and how they're placed on different parts of the building, and looking at other bits and pieces of West African culture in terms of mask making, and then create my own. Drawing inspiration from video game developers, film artists from African American diaspora. It gave a different perspective in how to move forward in terms of my architectural drawings, and drawing inspiration from artists like Lena Iris Victor, and then taking themes from sci-fi films such as Blade Runner and recreating them using the Afrofuturist aesthetic. So taking all these things with the symbols, the patterns, the imagery, you can take the origins of African architecture and then move forward through the timeline and kind of start to pick apart these pieces, not to kind of romanticize what it was, but more of a tribute, and to kind of have a consistent theme in terms of form. Because pre-colonial architecture in Africa, a lot of it was function. It was more for function over form and aesthetic, and it was post-colonial Africa where you start to kind of have these different forms and aesthetics introduced into the environment. So when you're going from north to east to south to west, you find that there's different kinds of aesthetics. And it's just important to have cultural empathy whilst you're going through the design process. So in terms of contemporary architecture, you have people like David Adjaye, and with his work currently, this from the Biennale, I can't remember which year, I think it was like last year or the year before, he's using the red clay, which is kind of very prominent in parts of Africa, to create a gallery. And then you had Francis Kere, who takes his homeland of Burkina Faso. He loves the place so much that when he's doing his work, he incorporates his culture in his designs. And this is from the Serpentine Pavilion, and how this was kind of his way of bringing the whole tree imagery and having people to gather underneath the tree in the same way that they would in Burkina Faso. His school in Gondo uses local materials and trained up people to kind of build the school, and not only is he just providing a structure and a place for learning, but he's providing jobs as well. So in terms of contemporary architecture, it's quite inspiring. And then you have Hassan Fadi, Arabic architect, and he uses similar aesthetic in his work uses similar aesthetic. So these are the kind of things that help me develop the color and the tone of some of my work, and trying to incorporate that overall. So creating a portal to this new world, it was to make a quote unquote Wakandan embassy, but moving forward, it starts to kind of move away, and you start to see where I've started to place the symbology that I discovered, creating components and bringing these things together to create a whole environment. So it's more of like a thing where each part has its story, and then bringing it overall to a master plan by laying it out like traditional village master plans. And taking this geometry, I started to recreate that using the components that I had made. started to place them in 3D space and slowly developing and building on top of it more and more to create a new world to describe Afrofuturism, but which also took heavy inspiration from contemporary music and imagery and the vernacular in itself. So these are some of the visuals that I created from this project. And then taking things further, again, to using my rendering and modeling techniques, and then overlaying the symbology and imagery over and over again, and then producing new things and doing basically a world building exercise. Thank you for joining in our presentation. Any questions?
Hi, yeah, I had a quick question.
Yep.
Apologies if you said this already. I've had some connection issues and I might have missed it. But as you've researched, obviously, a lot of African culture when you've been looking into this project, do you think that oftentimes African culture can sort of be generalized into one certain style when really, say, Egypt is going to have a very different culture to, say, I don't know, the Ivory Coast or something? Because obviously they're very different countries, but they're all in,
yeah. So I did kind of mention, I don't know if I dropped off when I mentioned it, but yeah, I said that like we tend to find that in Western culture that we treat other cultures outside of it as a monolith, and we really shouldn't, because even if like you're saying, the experience and the vernacular that is used in North Africa is very different from West Africa, and we have to be very mindful of that, because that allows us to have the cultural empathy moving forward and helping out the end user, because at the end of the day, when we're designing, it's for the end user. But this project in itself wasn't really for an end user per se. Like it was more of a way to kind of express a visual vernacular. But we do tend to kind of treat different cultures as a monolith. Like even with Asian culture, Asia is a very large continent, and you have East Asian culture and South Asian culture, which is very, very different. I think I have a bad internet connection. Sorry.
That's great, thank you.
Hi, I had a question.
Yeah.
Yeah. Obviously your project was fictional. How can you hear?
Yeah, I'm just having some internet trouble.
Sorry, no worries.
Sorry. Can you hear me now?
Yeah. So obviously your project was fictional. How do you think we can implement these styles?
Yes, sorry, go on.
Sorry. Obviously your project itself was fictional, but how do you think we can implement this into Western architecture and architecture where we are? Like these kind of techniques and aesthetics and material choices?
First of all, I'd say context is king or queen, however you want to go about saying it. You have to think about the end user and how you're going to bring these materials and aesthetics on board. So like, what is the narrative of the project? And not only that, is as when we're bringing projects in, we kind of have to look at planning policy as well. So how can we convince planning officers to allow these things to be made? As like small interventions would be cool. You can do that easily, bringing this aesthetic in as a small intervention, but as an overall thing, it's definitely planning is the way forward, and kind of like coming up with a master plan which incorporates these elements. That's just my opinion.
And do you believe that that kind of style of architecture has a place in the society we live in?
That's a yes and no answer. Unfortunately, it's not definitive. It really depends on what the purpose is. So if you're having to use certain techniques and methods to keep a building cool naturally, it would work to have some kind of aesthetic that would be from the Middle East or Africa to kind of use those natural ventilation techniques. But in terms of just as a pure aesthetic, it depends on where the architecture is going and what is the story behind it, and how do you navigate that and present that when you're putting it through into planning. If it's more of a tribute kind of thing, then that works. But I think from my experience, there's, in this environment in particular, there's a kind of a set thing and in how architecture is presented. I think it depends on how well you present it.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Yeah. Nice.
Roger, I think Roger's got a question.
Yeah.
Well, I would begin by saying, George, thank you for sharing this. I think it's absolutely fascinating. And the phrase that really resonates with me is black is not a monolith. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And what I'm also interested in your interest in music, and one of my favorite albums actually is a piece of music that was developed by Ali Fakhr Toure and Raikuda. And Ali Fakhr Toure is a man of Mali, and Raikuda is a white guy from Texas. And we know about that kind of history of transportation of slaves into southern states of America and the field calls and all of that stuff. But then you've got a white guy in Texas responding to that heritage. And I think that's where it gets really rich and really interesting. And maybe one of the paradigms that we all need to explore much more is music and the way it flows and the way it's not bounded by boundaries. Somehow music seems to get under the radar, and that's, I think, a real potential for architecture.
Yeah, music is actually quite I think it's undermined in terms of using it in architecture, because there's so many visuals that are created when you're looking at music. You've got Ali Fakhr Toure, is Mali artist. He's like, it's like fusion psychedelic kind of African sound. Yep. And that creates that creates a sort of imagery, like because one of the things that I find about music is that if you take away the lyrics and the words and you just leave the sound waves, everybody has their own response to it. So the percussion, the strings, the woodwind instruments, and or even when you're having like a cappella vocalizations, that also breeds a certain reaction, and the feeling that comes from that can present the story in a visual way, by if you were to do art at the same time, or figure out how these things kind of intertwine with each other. So like you have performances from groups such as Earth, Wind and Fire, where they draw heavily from like Kemet and the sci-fi kind of thing, and there's always that their narrative is always a fantasy space kind of adventure that is filled with with love and care at the same time, which has a feeling of elation depending on what soundtrack you're listening to. And I think in terms of design, we kind of dictate that as well. When we're drawing, we try to dictate how people navigate a space, or what kind of feeling they get when they're experiencing an architectural space. And it'll be quite clever to kind of mix the two in more ways than it just being a visual aesthetic, but how you walk through a space, or how a material feels, and what kind of music does that remind you of. And with music generally, we kind of do associate a surrounding with it. Like classical music would be reminiscent of a palace in Vienna, or hip hop, people would immediately think about New York. And then country music, like North Carolina, Texas and stuff. So it does evoke a feeling, and with that feeling, you as an individual create your own imagery for that. I don't know if that really answers your question, but it's more for me. It's just kind of
perfectly. Yes, thank you.
George, I was just wondering, because of your interest in film, I was wondering if you had any recommendations for people to watch, other than like the ones you said about like Blade Runner and Black Panther. I was wondering if there's sort of any more that you find inspiring or enjoy watching.
Yeah, okay, cool. Film. All right. So a bit of a weird one. The Departed is actually quite architectural. It was set in Boston, but the shots that are used, it sets the frame and the pace of the film as well, which is quite cool. I already mentioned Blade Runner and Black Panther. So many films. Space Odyssey 2001 sets this clean kind of aesthetic. Stanley Kubrick. Christopher Nolan films, doesn't matter which one, any of them would be good.
I haven't actually seen The Departed before. I've only heard it like referenced in Simpsons, but I'll definitely check it out if you say it's architectural.
Yeah, for me it's quite architectural, especially when they're like going when they're going through the story and they're setting the views and everything, and even like when they have like little analogies and stuff, and it kind of goes back and forth. It's weird, and I only started to realize that I think on my third or fourth watch, because the first two watches it was just very passive. I've seen someone mention Parasite there. I haven't seen it though. I need to watch that.
Yeah, that's
Gattaca.
I haven't seen Gattaca.
I've seen Gattaca. Gattaca is actually quite good as well.
Check that one out.
You hit me there because I watch so many films and trying to think like which one's the best one.
I'd be the same if someone asked me on the spot.
Yeah, you put me on the spot. If you gave me a week to kind of like write a list of films, I'd probably be able to do it.
Have you heard of a website called Letterboxd?
No.
You should, if you enjoy films, you should definitely check it out. It's like a social media platform, but for film reviewing, and you can cool. You can sort of, it's kind of like IMDb, but more like intuitive, and you can add all your mates on there, and you can like review films, and there's like a 5-star rating, and you can see other people's reviews, and you can like follow other people and stuff. And yeah, it's good for like seeing all the films you've watched, and going back and looking at how you rated it when you watched it and stuff. I would definitely recommend it. Roger?
Ben, hi. Today's been a day of real revelation for me. You know, we say as teachers every day's a school day, and that's kind of trite. But today is well, your lecture, George, is marking my second embrace of Black culture today. I went to a Zoom meeting earlier by a man of color who questioned the notion of BAME, B-A-M-E, as an entirely white construct that it's white people that have defined BAME, yeah?
Yeah.
And that really, you know, that hit me right in the chest. And at Portsmouth, we're trying to do some really good work. But it made me really question the way in which we do it. I don't know whether you would have a view on that, George, but it kind of pulled the rug from under me emotionally and physically, I've got to admit, by a really powerful statement that it's another level of imposition and discrimination. I just wonder if you've got anything to say about that.
I have some personal views, just
Yep.
to kind of like caveat that and make sure that it's not associated with anyone in any way.
No.
But in BAME, for me, I don't like that term, like, at all. I think it's, as was described earlier, it's been constructed by the white rule and kind of like bringing, like, so the experience of an ethnic minority within white culture, yes, it does share some similarities in terms of how you find yourselves in positions of workplace and how you behave and how you present yourself to others. So it's more of a palatable thing, depending on where you are, really and truly. Like even small things, like even growing up on a council estate, entering certain environments, I personally, for me, I had to kind of adjust my behavior, not stand up so tall. I'm not to say I'm a really tall person, but I'm 6 foot. So for somebody of average height and regular build, that can be quite imposing, just so they can feel a bit safer. But in BAME as an experience is very, very different from person to person. And I think it's another way of trying to talk about an experience as a monolith, but you have to treat it very differently from each ethnic group to within that context of speaking. Understandably, that there aren't that many ethnic minorities within certain industries, and for me personally, I kind of look at it from a mathematical standpoint and look at the demographic and the percentage of the demographic. And I think another thing about having ethnic minorities within the industry of the built environment, it's quite, especially architecture specifically, is that it doesn't really appeal to a lot of people in that way. Architecture, for me, I've kind of always seen it as a very white middle class thing. Not as it's just everyone that I kind of like look to for inspiration happen to have that background. Our architects that we mention very so often have come from that background, and nothing against them, they can't help being born in that position, but it just doesn't, a lot of the time you're more drawn to what you're familiar with and what you know. So having that discussion, I think now it's kind of like, how do we go into spaces and schools and kind of make it more appealing? Because our industry has that issue in itself. And then not only that, I think that's directly linked to the financial situation of architects. it's kind of well known within the community that architecture isn't that well paid, and a lot of the people from ethnic minority backgrounds, their financial situation, they're kind of trying to get up a level. So it's not like they're going to be encouraged to kind of pursue it. But if we were to present the study, you're not kind of just set to doing architecture alone. It probably bring more of a crowd and bring more talent and viewpoints and different ways of presenting the subject in itself. Because I know people who have gone and studied architecture and ended up doing environment design in video games. Some people who've gone on to do set design. And I think if we were to kind of like start talking about bringing more people, bring more faces, I think it's bring more stories that appeal to people. Because going into a school in a London council estate area, talking about Christopher Wren and Palladio is not really going to resonate with them. They need something a bit more contemporary to kind of like draw them into it. And to go back to the BAME discussion, we have to kind of look at that properly and not treat, as I said earlier, Black is not a monolith. Ethnic minority, being an ethnic minority is not a monolith either. And my experience as a first generation Ghanaian is not going to be the same as a first generation Bengali person. So we can't treat it as such. We have to respect the cultural differences and have that kind of empathy to kind of to be able to communicate and bring these things in together. Just seen a comment from Rachel Brown. I think that is right. Okay. Yeah, we have to enjoy the differences as well, because I think we can come up with more solutions, acknowledging the differences and moving forward with that.
Sorry.
Good.
No, I was gonna say, I know Ashley has a question, but I just wanted to add something to what you were saying. Yeah, I think what you're saying was really important. I was watching this interview with Adam Khan Architects, and it was with this YouTube channel called Archie Makes, which I thought was an amazing idea. It's basically like kids from like secondary school, like getting interested in architecture. And like both the kids were from minorities, and one of them was a girl, one of them was a boy. And Adam Khan was kind of talking about getting like younger kids involved in architecture and like letting them know what it is from a young age. And I think that's a really good way to get a lot more people involved in architecture, because I think when I was in primary school, I didn't know what architecture was. And maybe if it was like promoted as more of like something you can aspire to, like an astronaut, then I think that would be something that could get more people involved. Yeah.
Yeah, to add on to that, I had a conversation with a mate last week, and he pointed out that if you were to go up to 10 different people who are in the architectural field and ask them what's an architect, you'll get 10 very different answers. I think as a group, as a community within the built environment industry, we have to be very clear as to what is an architect, because then that helps with describing it and bringing it to people so they understand what it is and what we do. And there needs to be some kind of unification on our stances and how we bring in the culture. Because I feel like with the whole BAME thing, it's been very knee-jerk reactions to kind of prove that it's like, hey, we have ethnic minorities, we're not racist, we're not kind of like falling into that trap, but it can't be helped. So going into schools and kind of like doing workshops and discussing things, yeah, that's a good idea, it's a great idea. Doing things outside of school as well, like running clubs. One thing I find a shame, and probably showing my age here, is the disappearance of youth clubs and doing workshops and stuff, because a lot of the things that we learn happen in these places. And I think post 2010, you don't really hear many of these kind of things happening. Not name dropping any governments, but just saying post 2010 general election.
Hi, I have one more question. It may be a bit philosophical. So I was having a conversation with my friends regarding the whole BAME and equality, and we believe there is a possibility that in the future, diversity quotas and colored people and people of different ethnic backgrounds may even be tokenized in the future, where companies may say that they may use the fact they have a certain diversity quota as a form of advertisement, whereas and I think very similar was something regarding the owner of Reddit retiring as CEO so a person of a different ethnic background could get his job. And it was where we were saying is, how do you think we can strive for a balance between equality and almost tokenism? Because I think my worry is in the future we're going to reach a stage where people are going to have ethnic diverse companies for the sake of it rather than based on the actual merit and skill of the person. So how do you think we can strive towards being more equal but not kind of tokenizing it in a sense that we value people based on their views, their qualities and their experience as opposed to their backgrounds? It's a bit of a hard question, I do apologize.
It's a big question. Don't like. I don't want to take up too much. My view on it, personal view, just to stamp that in there. Like, these are my views. I think there's two lines of conversations there. There's this there's equality, giving everybody a chance, but then is that actually more equity than anything? Because it's like impartial and fair. So when we're looking at it, it's like the tokenism thing is like, you're just going to pick someone just because they're black, but are you going to pick them because they're black or Asian just to make it look like you're good? Or are you going to actually make sure that these people are trained up and can present themselves doing a good job, and giving them the opportunity to train to get into higher positions and prove that they're as good as anyone else? Like, I can't remember what the statistic is, but in America, Black women's like the most educated group in the country. They're decorated with loads of degrees and stuff, and then a lot of like really difficult areas of work, and yet you don't find them in higher positions of quote unquote power or influence.
I find even with universities almost, they seem to promote certain ethnic diversities when realistically, in my opinion, I think although it's important to be equal, it should be a principle of the institution rather than something they promote. It should be more, we give equal opportunities and we train people to a higher level rather than based on their backgrounds.
Yeah, that is a very nuanced, that's a nuanced discussion, and there's so many factors like involved with that, because it's yeah, you want to show that people have equal opportunities and being trained up, and there isn't such a thing as favoritism. And I think where you might be coming from is that you're concerned that because of this there will be kind of a thing where a certain group of people will be pushed to the side just so that it can be proved to that there is no racism. But I think that, again, it goes back to how do you appeal to the groups? Are you just picking them for the sake of picking them? Is there room for development for them? Is there longevity in the thing that they're going to do? These are my personal views and how I see things. Or even giving them the same respect if they were to kind of go off and do their things in their own way, in a sense. It's a very, I think there's a lot of balance required, and the conversation is so nuanced that you have to have this discussion almost every day, just to make, you have to, a term I use with my friends is like G checking. So it's like you check each other, you make sure that you're on the right path for that individual, or if you're going a bit too wayward, they kind of bring them back.
I like that.
And the conversation, the conversation kind of requires like everybody to be involved. It can't just be like 6 white men in a room saying like, how do we prove that we're not racist? So, or how do we prove we're not sexist?
Yeah. Sorry, difficult topic, but yeah, I like your
excluding people. Yeah, it's a difficult one. Sorry if I didn't answer it properly, but that's what I thought.
I get
think
George.
Sorry,
yeah, hi. That's all right. It's interesting what you say about BAME, because I think it just supports the idea of the straight white male being the default per se. And I was wondering, because obviously you're a fan of film, I was wondering if, I know that trope is quite common in film. I know it's changing recently. We're seeing a lot more non-straight characters, a lot more non-white characters. And I was wondering if you had any comments on how we're developing as a community, where we're showing these stories that weren't shown before, and if you think how we could improve that in the future.
I think one of the things I've actually thought about this before, weirdly enough, I was thinking about this yesterday. I was thinking more about where the stories are told from, because but that requires a level of cultural understanding when you're telling these stories. So like context is like really key when we're looking at these things, and where the story and the cultural differences are coming from, and who the main character is, what perspective are we looking at it from. So if we're going to tell a story on like bureaucracy in Washington, very likely that the story is going to be told from the white man's perspective in America. And then a lot of the struggle films, for some reason, the default is to use African American communities, but there are economical struggles within a lot of ethnic groups that aren't shown. And I feel this is another personal viewpoint of mine, but I feel like it's more of a rich versus poor kind of thing, but race is the easiest tool to use to kind of define a story, because everybody's always scared of the other. It's been a long kind of thing that I've noticed and picked on, like when I'm watching different forms of media, as to how they spin certain stories, and even the notion of a white savior coming into certain areas to kind of fix things or make things right, and then being the hero of the day. Again, that's a very nuanced conversation, and I think it's something that can't be summarized in a 2-minute answer. But I think context is definitely where it's at. Yeah, it's like, what is the story, and what is the story, and what perspective are we showing?
I mean, it was interesting that you comment on the black struggle often portrayed in films, because I was going to ask if you had any comments regarding the idea that most of the time when a story is focused on non-white characters, it's often on the struggle they face. And I was wondering if you just had any other, but you've already brought that up, so thank you. Cool.
George, I had a question about, you mentioned the term monolith a couple of times. I'm not actually familiar with that. I was just wondering if you could sort of expand my knowledge.
So when I was discussing the Black Monolith, so it was like kind of like saying that the Black experience is just one experience that's shared throughout, and it's not. It's several. So if you're going to talk about it as like a one experience, I guess you'd have, again, I keep saying context is key in like this discussion, and it really is, because if I'm going to discuss my experience as a Black ethnic minority within a white majority, I'm going to meet other people who also have these kind of similar experiences. So it's certain things like being the only person of African origin within the office environment, or being only person that's Caribbean or Asian, and realizing that there's certain differences in how people come on to you and approach you. I have noticed in certain environments where people decide to change their speech pattern because it's the way I look and the way I dress. Well, I mean, I guess I make them feel comfortable in that way, but it's just kind of it makes me raise an eyebrow as to like, why didn't you talk to this person in that way? But we also like when I speak of the monolithic experience, it's like Africa as a continent is very diverse in itself. I think it's like what 54, 57 different countries within the continent. And when we're talking about Africa, we have to remember that they operate very differently. Like Pan-Africanism was a notion that was introduced, like I think in the 60s or something like that. And initially, when I heard about it, I was like, oh yeah, this is actually a pretty cool idea, but I don't think it's the greatest of ideas because everything is very, very different from country to country. And even then, like within each country, there are different tribes and how they operate with each other. And I think it's just understanding these differences and respecting them and collaborating. And I think collaboration is more the term I'd favor in that sense. And it's the same as if I'm talking about white people, I will differentiate between white America and UK, white, and what have you. Like there's so many subcategories, we can't kind of keep them all speaking of them as one thing.
Can I just chip in on that, please?
Yeah, go for it.
I mean, the biggest intellectual rugby tackle I've ever had as a teacher at postgraduate level was talking to a woman of color and suggesting she talk about her African experience. And this is how clumsy I am and have been. And her response was, don't call me African. And then she went on to kind of drill down. She said, I come from Nigeria, and I come from this tribe, and my grandfather is an elder in this tribe. And all of a sudden, I started to understand how stupid and colonial I can be in dealing with situations like that. And there was no malice intended, no insult intended, but it was just clumsy and dumb.
In saying that, you have to be very particular on having these discussions, in my opinion. Especially when it comes to somebody's background, I like to let people lead the charge on that discussion.
Yeah.
So I'll either ask the question as to where they're from or what actually even before that, like I'll say, what are you interested in? Because people who, when you give somebody the chance to go forward in something that they're interested in, they will lead the charge and become the expert in that conversation, and they will teach you things that you didn't know before, and they'll produce something amazing because they are genuinely interested in it. And the one thing that we cannot do is assume, because I don't know, a lot of people probably heard this, but when you assume, you make an ass out of you and me. And assumptions can be very, very dangerous, and clumsy in some instances.
I also think there's an issue about that kind of colonial education imposition and our expectation of people to respond in a certain way, George. And
it's definitely,
that taught me a lot.
It's definitely a thing where we have been taught a very colonial viewpoint of a lot of things within Western European education systems. Yeah. We rarely have the chance to kind of explore different world histories. Growing up, the history that I was taught was about Henry VIII and his wives, World War I and II, ever so briefly. The closest thing I had to quote unquote African history was learning about the Egyptians. But even then, Egypt and North Africa has a very, very rich history.
Yeah.
Especially with it being on the coast of the Mediterranean. There are different kind of like empires that came and touched down in North Africa. Going up to colonial times, like you had the French colonies, like so many different things. But we're not taught about it from the perspective, because I just think that with history, when history is taught, maybe it was a thing where to kind of like have a better influence, you take away the identity to kind of impose the quote unquote superior's identity to be able to manipulate lands in a certain way. Again, personal viewpoint. Some people might share this, but I think that's probably what it is. And I think moving forward, it's up to us to correct it, either by restructuring and decolonizing educational systems, or actually giving opportunities to do extracurricular activities that involve the chance to kind of research these things. And like, yeah, very good point, Catherine. In the World War, when we talk about World War, we talk about the European perspective and the European impact. We don't talk about what it did to Japan and other parts of Asia and how that was affected, and how internment camps weren't just for the Jewish community, but they were also made for the Japanese prisoners in World War II. And that's why you have a very like diverse background in areas such as Hawaii, like where I think that's where Pearl Harbor and stuff happened. I'm not very familiar with like my World War II history, but I'm just going by what I remember. And I think most of our media outlets are from a European, like the European thing is just the set standard and the default. And I think it's time to kind of like move away from that being the default. We can still, not to say that we have to erase it completely, it's still there, yes, but we have to acknowledge like the other parts as well, and give rise to the stories coming from everyone else, everyone else's viewpoint. Yeah, there's a lot of like thought-provoking stuff when you try and have this discussion. You lot have really put me on the spot today as well.
That's been great. Actually, I just wanted to ask a question about style. Since you're a Part 3 student, I know when we first started architecture, they said like you're going to start developing your own style, and I just wondered if you felt like you had developed your own style already, and how you've kind of done that, because before this we were kind of talking about how you get your inspiration for stuff, and I thought that was really interesting and might be helpful to like other students listening.
I have my third year tutors to thank, Harry Bucknell and Melissa Clinch. Specifically Melissa Clinch. What she made me do one tutorial was actually talk about things I genuinely like, and it wasn't even, we didn't even have an architectural conversation. She just asked me, what do I like? And I was talking about comic books, anime, manga, illustration, cinema. And then she said I should show my work. And she said, these drawings, everything that you've just mentioned, somehow put it in there. And I did that. And the next week, I just developed this thing, and I've just kind of been following it since. I think it's important to kind of like bring your interest into the study, like your personal interest, because like it's so much easier to kind of do something. And the thing is, it's like you might be worried about how your work will be criticized during a critique, but like just become the expert of your own thing, because it makes it very difficult to kind of like critique. Not well, actually, no, to be fair, critiques are always going to come, let me just go back and backtrack on that a little bit. Like critiques are always going to come, but the thing is, if you have a reason for what you're doing and it makes sense, it makes it very difficult to question. In that sense of like visual aesthetic. And then obviously like you'll have to kind of take heed when it comes to the form and how things work and how you navigate through certain architectural spaces. But it's also about like what story is it? What's the narrative of your project? What story are you telling with it? Does the style that you want, the visual style you want to use, represent that project? Like if you're somebody who likes style architecture, you wouldn't use comic book illustration per se. You could probably use aspects of it, but you wouldn't use that as your aesthetic for your drawings. So yeah, developing your own style, just take whatever you like. Well, it doesn't matter where it's from. You can find a way to make it architectural.
That's really helpful. Thank you so much.
No worries.
I think oh, sorry.
Sorry, if someone else has a question, I don't mind waiting.
Yeah, sorry. I don't know if that's your name, Tendo.
Yeah, hi everyone. Thank you for this talk and everything. And yeah, I just wanted to mention, first of all, I'm a Ugandan student currently studying in China. And yeah, I've noticed one thing with the whole architectural vibe and everything. Right now, I'm studying civil engineering, but in context with architecture. And I've noticed the same thing with everything is that they talk about incorporating your nature, like everything that's around you. They call it feng shui. Everything that's around you and putting it in your actual designs and everything. I wanted to know exactly when you're incorporating these things into your designs, what do you actually consider? For example, let's say you're designing something for, let's say, a client or maybe yourself or for a certain project. When you're presenting something to someone as a client, how do you make them look at this as, this is my design, this is what I think incorporates best with nature, and this is what I think would be best for this project, even if you're not used to this kind of thing in the whole architecture space? How can I push it towards you and make it something that you're interested in? How can I bring out your ideas of that certain project that I'm thinking of? How can I push my idea onto you as an architect, an engineer, or someone with the same ideals? Yeah.
Interesting question. So I would go about that in terms of understanding what my client requirements are, refining them, and then bringing my expertise and then really showing that I know what I'm talking about. You kind of have to present like you've got your brief, your context. What is the issues? What are you solving? And how are you going to solve it? And you can describe it in that sense, and present it in that sense. And then for clients who aren't so architectural, a lot of 2D drawings and plans and sections and technical drawings won't make sense to them. So it's kind of better to present stuff that they can immediately relate to. So 3D visuals and sketches. People respond to sketches very well. I had no idea until I started working in the industry how well sketches work for people, because when you present renders, people outside of architectural design and the built environment, well, actually, let me just stick with architectural design because that's what I know. People outside of architectural design, when you present them with 3D renders, they may not be the best 3D renders in the world, but they immediately think that this is going to be built. But when you present a sketch, the sketch kind of shows that it's a work in progress, and it gives them the thought that they can kind of have input before something's finalized. I think it's just it's a psychology thing. I don't know where it comes from or why that works. I've never really looked into it, but that's what I've noticed in the last however many years. I'm not sure if that answers your question, but I think taking charge and understanding exactly what it is that you're doing and what you're presenting, like even your own idea, you have to know exactly what it is and why you've done. There has to be a method to what you've done, because when there is, it makes it easier for you to explain because you fully understand it yourself.
Yeah, I understand. Thank you.
Okay, cool.
Hi, George. I had another question.
Yeah.
It sort of again links back to the whole idea of Black people in media always being presented as having some sort of struggle. But do you think there's something almost inherently racist about the idea of people who aren't white always being told, oh, you should explore your culture, or you should look at things from your culture? Because for all that person knows, you could have basically no link to it. You could be 10 generations away from, your original heritage. So do you think it's inherently racist to say just because you're not white, you should have a really close connection to your culture? Because there's almost that expectation for non-white people. Because I know certainly as a white person myself, I've never been told, yeah, you should really look into your family's history, that sort of thing.
Actually, that's a good, interesting. That's a point. Is it inherently racist? Making that assumption could be ignorant.
Yeah, it's not necessarily out of malice.
Yeah,
like Roger's story earlier, he didn't mean anything bad by it. It was just, just assuming that you have some really interesting culture just because you're not white. It's making assumptions based on race.
Yeah, I think I like, really and truly, I think I'd go back to what I said earlier about not making an assumption. I think because it comes across as ignorant in a sense, only if you were aware of where this person's from. Like you said, like this person could be 3 or 4 generations in and it could be as English as shepherd's pie. Like it could be a thing where that's all they know. Or like if they grew up in Scotland or whatever, like they know the bagpipes inside and out, but they don't know like, I don't know, different African cuisine or Asian cuisine. It really that's very nuanced. I mean, there's so many aspects that you'd have to take into consideration. It depends on who you're talking to. I'd just go as far as saying this is just, we have to stop making assumptions about people. You kind of have to ask and let them lead the charge on the discussion. I don't know if it's inherently racist. I mean, there's probably racial undertones. It's ignorant, but there are racial undertones, but I don't know if it's inherently racist, but there are definitely racial undertones to assume that this is the person. Like, say, for example, if I'm sitting on a bus in the middle of Leicester or something and it's cold and they turn around and tell me, oh, must probably not like that where you're from. And I'm just like, well, I was born in a West London hospital. I don't know what you mean, mate. That kind of thing. That could be seen as racist. Yeah, it could be seen as racist, yeah. Not sure if that answers the question.
No, absolutely. It's interesting to get your input because obviously I only have the white male British perspective of things, and it's interesting to see other people's side of the story.
Yeah.
Roger, I think you've got a question.
Just one more quick one. Since we've all been on lockdown, and people are spread out, our students are spread out over the globe, one thing that's really excited me is that when people are kind of relocating to their places of origin, they seem to be permissioning themselves to bring much more of their own cultural context into their work. That really excites me, and I wonder, it also makes me ask how compressive and impositional we are in terms of our expectations of students from across the world coming to Portsmouth and working within a certain cultural construct. It's anecdotal, it's an observation, but it really excites me as an opportunity.
I think the opportunity should definitely be welcomed.
Yeah.
It would definitely bring very diverse looking work, and even probably bringing out solutions from other areas in the world that could possibly be solutions that are found in your local context. It takes a viewpoint from another for you to see how things are. Like when we're in something, we have a very close-up perspective, but it's only when we take a step back or somebody else looking from the outside and they spot something that you don't. Yeah, it's definitely an interesting time moving forward, respectfully speaking.
Okay, I think we'll leave it there. But thank you so much for speaking, George. It's definitely created some really interesting discussions. And just hearing you speak about it all just is, yeah, it's very inspiring. Lots of things to take away.
I appreciate that. I wasn't sure if I was articulating myself quite well.
No, you honestly, you were great.
It was really good.
And your work is just outstanding as well. It's just awesome.
Thank you. Thanks for having me.
Could I also thank the PASS group, who are doing an amazing job this year, bringing in these really diverse voices to the school, which is long overdue. So thanks to Ben and Jubilee and the whole team, because you're making an amazing contribution to the school. Thank you.
Thanks, Roger.
Thank you,
Have
Roger.
a good evening, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your week.
Good evening, everyone. Bye.
Bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye, everyone.